that story when we talk about letting go of the self. Definitely compassionate inquiry is looking at how we create stories, how we live in the story, how our mind creates the world. So,
hmm
we know if we look in the Dhammapada, it's all there. So in a way, it's almost making some of these teachings so accessible when people begin to realize, oh my God, this is a story. Oh my God, I feel abandoned. And we begin to unpack that. Well, that isn't really a feeling, is it? That might be your experience. So tell us the story of abandonment.
Hello, and welcome to the Metta Hour podcast with Sharon Salzberg. I'm Lily Cushman. I produce this podcast, and today we're bringing you episode 244 with Valerie Mason-John. This is Valerie's first appearance on the pod, and they're here today talking about their new book, First Aid Kit for the Mind, Breaking the Cycle of Habitual Behaviors. If you don't know Valerie, they are a Dharma teacher, a speaker, author of 10 books. Valerie is a founding facilitator of Gabor Mate's Compassionate Inquiry, and they're also a co-founder of the training program Mindfulness Based Addiction Recovery. A lot of their work as a public speaker centers around mindfulness for addiction and trauma. And the conversation starts with Valerie sharing their really harrowing early life journey and how that ultimately led Valerie to recovery and to the Dharma. And there's a lot of conversation here about different recovery tools, including Gabor Mate's Compassionate Inquiry, the Recovery Cafe, and all of the storytelling work that Valerie has done, including playwriting, poetry, and the way they've worked with story as a way to support being in recovery and also heal lifelong trauma. Valerie closes out the conversation with a guided meditation from their new book. So a lot of tools in this conversation. And before we get to the episode, a quick announcement for you. Sharon has some upcoming virtual events. On August 15th, she's doing a workshop hosted by East West Books, Heart as Wide as the World. And you can head over to sharonsalzberg.com to register. The other thing I want to mention is that we're going to be offering some election stress resources coming soon for those of you in the US. We're quickly heading towards a presidential election in November, and so you can keep an eye out for some resources heading your way. So let's get to today's episode. Valerie Mason-John and Sharon Salzberg.
Well, hello. It's wonderful to be here together, and I'm so glad that you're on the podcast.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for having me. And it's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Sharon.
It is always a pleasure for me as well. And how are you, and where are you calling in from today?
I'm calling in from Gibson's the Sunshine Coast, which is a 40-minute ferry ride from Vancouver. And to say it's not the island, we're part of the mainland. It's just that the stretch of water is too big to build a bridge or a tunnel.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, reading some about your life story, how you came to spiritual practice after such a difficult and tumultuous childhood growing up in foster care, being unhoused and incarcerated at a very young age. And you've come through all of that to live a life of service, helping others. In your TEDx talk, you say, "Loving kindness practice saved my life." So, why don't we start there? Can
Mm.
you explain that incredible statement? How did loving kindness save your life?
Loving kindness most definitely did save my life, and I have to give a shout out for your book, Sharon. I can
Thank you.
remember I can remember your book on loving kindness. I think, I wasn't aware that I could learn to love and like myself. And the thing is, Sharon, that I had a lot of health self-hatred towards myself. In fact, my mantra was, I hate myself. I hate
Mm.
myself. And I used to do that 10 to a dozen. I can remember leaving a meditation hall, and I was in my 20s, and leaving a meditation hall, my fists clenched tight, my body rigid, waiting for the tube in London, and just being completely shocked as I'd slow down and I could really hear the background of what was happening in the foreground of my experience. And, that practice of loving kindness, of learning to give appreciation and love and light towards myself, and to kind of expand that out to a friend, to a neutral person, to an enemy of the mind, was just radical. Of course, I have to admit, giving loving kindness towards myself was incredibly difficult. It
Mhm.
was
Of
easy to do
course.
it for everybody else.
Yeah, of course. That's not an uncommon experience, and I think very telling in so many ways.
Yeah, I actually what I did, I actually put myself in every stage for a year. I just knew intuitively that's what I needed to do. And then in the following year, I put a different body part in each stage. And
Mm.
that was one of the ways that I really learned to come into harmony with oneself, to come into some attunement with myself. And then, of course, I developed this practice of the five basic needs of the heart to just really break down that first stage. Because, as you say, many people find that first stage really difficult, which is why some people introduce it with the benefactor.
How lovely, yeah. So as you've gone on to study, of course, other techniques, I'm curious about how you feel looking back now at that loving kindness practice and um, where it fits in the context of these other practices that you've also explored.
I would say that loving kindness really is my backbone. It's a place that I have to begin from. I can't forget it. It's it's yeah, it's constant, and in a way it keeps my heart open to me and my heart open towards others as well. And I always say jokingly, like, if I ever get into conflict with somebody, I grovel back to loving kindness because it works. It really does work. And in a way, I would say that this practice has really opened up the aperture and made my world so much more plentiful, so much more wider. Because once upon a time, I would come across people and I just think, no, I got nothing to do with you. I'm here, you're there, separate and other. Whereas the practice of loving kindness has just really taken that discrimination away and just really allowed me to connect with people without the story. So in a way, loving kindness, I think, really is that's the thing that helps us let go of the story of the story about people. So for me, loving kindness has to be part of my part of my Prozac. I always say that meditation is my Prozac,
Hmm.
and loving kindness is part of that ingredient in that Prozac.
I feel like looking at some of your incredible work in the world that I can just feel the loving kindness practice and your experience of it, your deep experience of it at the root of that. So, for example, you call yourself the bully doctor, and you do a lot of anti-bullying and anti-self-bullying work.
Yeah, it's I love that work because it puts me in relationship to the younger generation. It's so easy as you get older to age out of that younger generation unless you've got grandchildren or nephews and nieces. And so really it puts me back into relationship with young people. And actually, it allows me to heal an aspect of myself when I'm working with young people, because, young people struggle. I would say to people, parents, when they're struggling with the kids, I say, remember what it was like for you when you were young?
Mhm.
So, for me, this work is so important because it's not always that actually somebody is bullying another person. We can bully ourselves with that hatred, with that stinking thinking. And in a way, how can I um, enable young people to bully proof themselves, to begin to speak up and to speak out until somebody actually hears them? Because we know it's tragic that actually a kid can go home and actually tell a parent or a carer that they've been bullied, and the parent thinks they're doing the best thing, just go back and fight or man up, etc., whatever. And that doesn't help the young person at all. And so, really, I think part of my work is to really enable young people to speak up, to speak out, and to bully proof themselves, to really take care of themselves and actually keep on speaking until somebody will take them seriously and somebody will take action.
I also really take a note of your recovery work. You yourself are in recovery and you support others in addiction. You created an 8-step recovery program based on the teachings of the Buddha, Mindfulness Based Addiction Recovery. And your work centers a lot around mindfulness and loving kindness when dealing with addiction and trauma. So I wonder if you can say something about that journey for you and the role that your meditation practice has played in that work.
Yeah, thank you for asking me about that, because actually, what's so interesting is that I never actually defined being in recovery until I co-wrote the book 8-Step Recovery Using the Buddha's Teachings to Overcome Addiction. And then all of a sudden I became the recovery person. And it's interesting, when you write a book, it's like, so you write a book, it goes out in the world, it's time to move on.
Hmm.
How was I able to move on? How was I able to move on from the book? But and what I will say is it's interesting because I have been working in the field of recovery for a long while. I can remember when I was living in England, and I was working for an organization where women would go to rehab instead of prison. And they basically, their crimes were always done under the influence of alcohol and drugs. And that
Hmm.
was a real turning point for me, Sharon. It was a real turning point because I remember two things. It was in the days where you could smoke everywhere, and I did smoke. I'd stopped smoking, and I remember my colleague in the doorway smoking a cigarette, and thinking, gosh, we're no different. we
Hmm.
It's so easy to work in that demographic and actually think, oh, yeah, I'm different. I don't have those issues. And then on that same day, I can remember we were looking at the cycle of change, the Petraska cycle of change, which was a cycle that was created to help stop smoking, and it was used for other addictive and habitual behaviors. And I can remember one of the women saying, it's not possible to stop drinking. And I remember I couldn't answer that because I wasn't an alcoholic, but I had alcohol in my life and I didn't know. And so actually that really spurred me on to think, okay, let me see what it would be like not to drink for a year. And actually it was transformational, because I would say that my core addiction is food. I don't say was, because it's something that I still struggle with, and alcohol would be a gateway. If I drank
Hmm.
alcohol, I'd be in the food. And so in a way, it's interesting. In those days, disordered eating, I was a chronic bulimic anorectic, and it wasn't necessarily seen as an addiction, but of course it is an addiction. I always say to people, if you want to know how it's an addiction, then read the 8-Step Recovery book. But that was part of my journey of recovery. Of I had to let go of everything, let go of the alcohol, let go of the recreational substances so that I could actually begin to let go of using the food and really learning to come into relationship with food in a completely different way. And that's still, yeah, I'm in recovery. It's lifelong. This because one has to come into relationship with food. It's different with all the other stuff and say, okay, well, I won't have that. I won't have this. Although I don't have sugar. I mean, sugar is something that I just don't have in my diet, because if it's in my diet, I'll just be in the food and have my head down the toilet, and that's not where
Mhm.
I want to be.
Well, I remember years ago, was when I was visiting Seattle, teaching, and one of the places I visited was this place called the Recovery Cafe, which was basically a community center where people in recovery could spend the day and, either do classes or just hang out and, in a sober way. And it was so beautiful to see that kind of community support and healing. And it reminded me, of course, of the Buddhist teachings, and one of the three jewels being the Sangha or community. And I'm wondering, where that fits in your vision of addiction recovery.
Yeah, recovery cafes are really important, and I think they were something that came out of, was it Bruce Alexander? I think, if I've got that right. Actually, he is based in Vancouver, but recovery cafes, 12-step meetings, Buddhist recovery meetings. It's all part of people's recovery programs. And what I love about recovery cafes, it normalizes it. It's like to be
Hmm.
able to just go to a cafe in your neighborhood and hang out makes it really normal. It's different from, oh, I'm going to this meeting and it's all, all anonymous. And
Hmm.
whereas in the recovery cafes, in fact, I wonder if it was the same one, because I was in Seattle a couple of months ago and actually
Hmm.
went into one of the recovery cafes there, and it was just great. People there playing dominoes, people there having a bite to eat, people just having an ordinary conversation, and it just really normalized. It just seems such a normal thing to do. So definitely, I think recovery cafes are really important to people's program of recovery. And what I want to say is it's so fantastic that over the past 10 or 15 years, we've seen Buddhist recovery just spread and
Hmm.
actually really, really get traction. And that there are some people who do their recovery all through Buddhist groups. I mean, I always say that I got my recovery in the rooms of meditation, I got my
Hmm.
recovery in the rooms of Buddhism.
Oh, beautiful. And I also wanted to ask you a question about Gabor Mate's work. And I know you're one of the founding facilitators of his Compassionate Inquiry course. And I would love to hear more about your involvement and about that program.
Yeah, Gabor, a dear friend and mentor of mine, he came into my life when I wrote Eight Step Recovery, and he wrote the foreword to the book. And I had started following Gabor's work, and I can remember being at a conference and watching Gabor do inquiry. And Sharon, in the Buddhist teachings, there is direct pointing. We have inquiry. It's something that we do in the mindfulness and Buddhist teachings. But when I watched Gabor do it, he was doing inquiry with four people simultaneously. And I was like, oh my God,
Mm.
this is the maestro of inquiry. And it was like, wow, okay, I've got something to learn from here. And then at some point, Sat Dharam, who had been following Gabor and actually really documenting his work, the two of them put their heads together and selected about 9 or 10 of us to actually work together to help create compassionate inquiry and bring it into the world. And that was very life transformative, in the sense that I got to, as we were helping to put this course together, we got to work on ourselves. And what I would say is that what I love about this process of compassionate inquiry, a couple of nuggets that I really got from that is the first is authenticity versus attachment. It's a really strong teaching that Gabor really brings to compassionate inquiry, that so often we go for the attachment rather than the authenticity, because if we were authentic, we might lose the love of our parents, we might lose the love of our partners, we might lose the love of our friends. And so that really has an impact when we lose our authentic voice. And how can we begin to get back that authentic voice? Another thing which I think is really, really quite seminal to the compassionate inquiry teachings of, like, who did you talk to? You know, we have these traumatic experiences yourself, you had
Mhm.
your traumatic experiences in childhood, and who do we speak to? And often there's nobody to speak to.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so who do we end up speaking to? We end up speaking to ourselves. We end up beating ourselves up, and that's what really creates the trauma. It's not so much what happened to us, it's what we make it mean that actually really makes the trauma get a grip
Mm.
of our mental states. So it's a real process of really inquiring into people's experiences. And why I love it is because for me it's dharma. I mean, in a way, all these practices, I say, root from the Buddhist teachings. I always say, Sharon, that the oldest therapeutic program that we know of today, the oldest addiction program that we know of today, are the Buddhist teachings. If we look at the Abhidharma lists all the different mental states that we have. We know that the Buddha's first discourse said there is addiction to hedonism, which is lowly, coarse, and unprofitable, and there's addiction to self mortification, which is lowly, coarse, and unprofitable. And what we need is the middle way. So it's all in there. I just think, like, of course, because we can't take religion, etc., into particular places. And so I believe different people have created these different modalities. And coming back to compassionate inquiry, one of the things is about thoughts are not facts, which is all
Mhm.
in the Dharma. That actually, that story, when we talk about letting go of the self, definitely compassionate inquiry is looking at how we create stories, how we live in the story, how our mind creates the world. So,
Mhm.
we know if we look in the Dhammapada, it's all there. So in a way, it's almost making some of these teachings so accessible when people begin to realize, oh my God, this is a story. Oh my God, I feel abandoned. And we begin to unpack that. Well, that isn't really a feeling, is it? That might be your experience. So tell us the story of abandonment. So it's really it's giving people a different language. It's educating people to think differently, which will give them more freedom. Because
Mhm.
if we live in those stories, we lose our freedom. When we begin to realize that actually that's just a perception, it's not necessarily what happened, it's a
Mhm.
perception,
Mhm.
then we can have some more freedom.
That's wonderful. I want to come back in a little while to storytelling on a different level, but first, I want to talk about your new book, First Aid Kit for the Mind: Breaking the Cycle of Habitual Behaviors, which just came out in May of 2024 from Windhorse Publications. This is your 10th book, and I know what that means, That's incredible. And it's really, the book is like a manual of sorts. It's super accessible and it's a wonderful size. So, a big congratulations to you.
Thank you. And it's actually number 11.
Number 11.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I missed one. Sorry about that. It's
That's
even
okay. That's
bigger accomplishment.
okay.
So how's it been bringing the book into the world right now when it feels like there's certainly no shortage of global crises?
Yeah, it's really interesting that the first launch I had was online, which was really quite bizarre doing a launch online. I start touring with the book next month.
Mhm.
Uh, it's it's interesting, isn't it? I think writing books today, there's part of me, Sharon, thinking, is there a place for us writers who work in the nonfiction with AI on the back of our heels? So that was one thing when I was writing this, thinking, wow, is there a place for this? I think also, secondly, it was like, how many people read books as well? It's like people have such a short bandwidth. So I
Mhm.
think this is where the idea of a pocketbook came
Mhm.
about. It's like read, and I had fun working with it. That not just it was a pocketbook, but you could actually get a nugget of wisdom on one page.
Mhm.
And that actually, if you wanted a 15-minute practice, you could have a 15-minute practice. If you want a 1-minute practice, you can have a 1-minute practice. And then again, as you say, with what's actually happening out there in the world, I definitely had a bit of a dark night moment just a couple of weeks ago. I was on my way to co-leading a retreat in San Francisco, and I can remember just in that preparation time, pre-retreat time, and in meditation, and just thinking, how can we tell people who are living in Israel or in Palestine or anybody who's living in a war zone that they have created the world with their mind? You know, how can we tell people that? And really just had a bit of a dark night moment, and then again realizing, one of my colleagues today, I've just finished working with a group, and my chaperone, my intern, he lives in a he lives in Israel, and he's just said it's crazy. It's
Mhm.
it's crazy. Just an hour and a half down the road from him, there's a war going on, and it's just become normal. And yet, actually, in a way, asking, how are you living with this? And actually, he is able to live with it, not making it any bigger or any worse than what it is. Yeah. So it's anybody can practice no matter what conditions we are in. And so in a way, I really I really hope that somebody can get at least one thing from this book. I think for me what was really important is we have everything we need. We don't need to go out and buy something. We have the breath. I mean, talk about the breath. The breath is medicine. The breath
Mhm.
is medicine, and I think we forget that. I really wanna say that again, the breath is medicine, because at the moment, we're having that renaissance of the psychedelics, and,
Mhm.
medicine and psychedelics and medicine. And I wanna remind people, breath is medicine if we can connect back to the breath, because I know for some people it can be incredibly difficult connecting to the breath. Yeah. So in answer to your question, I really enjoyed uh, working on the book. And then something happens, you write a book and it goes out into the world, and you just don't know. Um, you just don't know where it will end up. But I always say, if one person gets something from the book, then we've done our job.
Yeah, no, it's really true, and, you're reminding me also of, how I was in sort of the beginning of my, period of isolation in the beginning of the pandemic when I'd come up here to Barre, Mass, which is where I am now, from New York City, thinking I was gonna be here for 2 weeks and, like, ride it out, you know? And New York was really in a difficult place. I knew a lot of people whose parents were getting sick and dying, and the anxiety was through the roof, and it was just this terrible time. So I thought, okay, I'll come up here for 2 weeks, and time went by, and at one point, I really began deeply asking myself, like, what's still true? What, given my plans are gone, my expectations of how it was going to be are gone. And there's a world of a lot of insecurity. And like I have asthma, and I felt very vulnerable. And so I kept saying to myself, what's still true? Like, what can I rely on? What can I hold on to? And I'm told that one of the meanings of the word dharma, which of course we tend to be familiar with from the Buddhist teaching as the Buddhist teaching or the truth or the laws of nature, actually means that which supports us,
Mm,
that which we can count on.
mm,
And I really came to it was a very deep investigation for me, and I really came to my practice, and all those
mm,
elements of my practice. And also that line originally from the Buddha, later echoed so beautifully by Martin Luther King Jr., where the Buddha said, hatred will never cease by hatred.
mm,
Hatred will
mm,
only cease by love. This is an eternal law.
mm,
And I always kept thinking, well, that's weird because I
mm,
think of the Buddha in a way as Mr. Impermanence. And here he is
mm,
saying, this is an eternal law. But
mm,
as uncomfortable as truth that might feel and impossible almost in certain situations, do I actually believe it's ever untrue? No, I actually think it's true. And
mm,
I count on that in some way, and so a lot of what you're saying is really is bringing me back to that time in my life when I really had to look very deeply in those ways.
mm. Yeah, it's interesting because where I lived, we just wasn't impacted in the
Mhm,
same way as many other places. Yes, I did have people die, back in the UK, and of course it was happening in the bigger cities
mhm,
in Canada, but it was so much easier for us, and so I definitely had the space to think, wow, this is an opportunity for us to practice. This
mhm,
is those of
mhm.
us who are Dharma practitioners. This is what they were telling us all the time. You
Yeah.
know, that I looked at it in terms of in the wheel of life, and I said, well, I've been in that God realm, and my God realm has run out, you know,
Mhm, mhm,
and actually this is impermanence, and how do I work with this? So it was a real opportunity to practice.
mhm,
Again, I have absolutely no idea who I would be if war came to my doorstep. I've had that privilege of living countries where the countries are at war elsewhere, but not on our
mhm,
doorstep. And
mhm,
and
mhm.
how does one practice? And
Yeah.
again, I think I was actually saying to the group that I was facilitating today, because a question came up. Well, um, when when you have clients who are going through something the same as you, how do you work with that? And I just said, for me, it's going back to practice.
Mhm,
Actually, my practice is the one reliable thing while I have my faculties. I don't know if I lose my faculties. I
mm,
tend to hope that energy of practice you know, will keep me more
mhm.
regulated, but who knows? But while I do have my faculties, I have the opportunity to turn to practice. Yeah.
So there are
Um,
many wonderful mindfulness practices in your book and many practical applications, which make me think of your teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, who was so eloquently simple in his approach to mindfulness and coming from a country at war, and I'm
mm.
wondering, was he a big influence in this project?
Thich Nhat Hanh. When I think of Thich Nhat Hanh, and I did sit with Thich Nhat Hanh, and yeah, he gave me a great teaching. But let me just come back to the first books I ever read on Buddhism. I can remember seeing that book on, what's it, something like Buddhism and a motorcycle. I know I've got that wrong, but something about the
Zen
motorcycle.
in the art of
Yeah,
motorcycle maintenance. Yeah.
that's it. I
Yeah.
remember seeing that on the bookshelf, but never, ever actually picking that up. But it was the miracle of mindfulness.
Hmm.
The miracle his book, The Miracle of Mindfulness, and had a book on loving kindness, and they were just so accessible, just so easy. It just made sense. And that really definitely were the first books. And I remember I went to Plum Village many, many moons ago, and I was really struggling because in my tradition, we have this a prostration practice, and how it was taught back in the day is that you had uh, women on your left shoulder, men on your right shoulder, and you had to
Mhm.
have your mother and father either side, and you had to prostrate with all beings. And I was just like, how am I going to do that? I
Mhm.
just, how can I do that? And I can remember asking Ty that question, how can I, how can I do this? How can I practice? How can I come into relationship with these people? And he just looked at me and he said, you have this strong voice, you have this strong body, because I was doing yoga, etc. You have this strong voice, you have this strong body, your parents are in you. And I just thought, wow, that is so true. No matter what, that actually I do carry part of their DNA. And that was just a real opening up to just to have gratitude for the father I've never ever known, never
Mhm.
met, and for the mother who, well, I won't even go into whatever, but anyway, just to able to open up and actually just have gratitude for these beings. So in a way, I would say that uh Thai definitely put me on the path of mindfulness and the path of just writing simply. You know, it's almost like Thai's teachings are simple, but they're not easy.
Mhm.
Yeah. And just that to be able to write and definitely gave me the invitation to be able to write accessibly. I come from a journalistic background, not really an academic background, although, I have been in the academy. So definitely, I would say definitely the spirit of Thich Nhat Hanh is very much there. And also, of course, when I say my root teacher, the Buddha, and then,
Mhm.
of course, my founding teacher of the tradition I'm in, Sangharakshita, and then so much more. It's as we traverse on this path, there's so much more that can influence our writings. I think the people that I've worked with have been a big influence on my writing.
When you said Sangharakshita, I thought of the center in Birmingham I was in once
Oh, wow.
and teaching. Yeah.
Mm, wow.
Yeah. It's quite a network. It's amazing.
It is. I will be at Barre, Massachusetts teaching next year as well, actually.
Are you all? Oh, fabulous.
Yeah. Mm.
So I often get this question from students, and it's phrased in somewhat different ways, but it's basically, how can I stay mindful all day? Or how can I keep this level of mindfulness, which I've gotten on retreat? And your book feels quite similar to the answer I give, which is short moments many times. So sometimes I say, it's not going to happen. You're not going to be mindful all day long at work,
Exactly.
but short moments many times a
Mm,
day is really the goal. And it's true. We're not
mm,
going to remain continuously
mm,
mindful, but we can create new habits and
mm,
almost rituals that
mm,
bring us back to ourselves over
mm.
and over throughout the day. And can you speak to that?
Yeah, I was thinking, well, what else can I add to that? But what I would say is sometimes I play with the mindfulness of breathing, and I always call it the mindful of breathing. And what I do want to say, especially when I think of the anapanasati, that actually it's a twofold practice, isn't it? It's that practice of noticing we've been distracted. And I
Mhm.
always say to people, the more times you notice you're distracted during the day, you're practicing, because people think the only practice is when I'm being mindful. And as you've said, how it's not possible to be mindful 24/7. What is possible is to notice when we're distracted. And then the second part is bringing ourselves back, which is why I really love that first tetrad of the Anapanasati, because, when we land on that fourth stage of just becoming aware of the breath on your upper lip inside the nostrils, that is teaching us to be with the subtleties of experience. And again, I always say to people, want this big experience. So, if I'm mindful, it's got to be this big experience, and I'm mindful 24/7. It actually may mean that actually you're just mindful for a nanosecond. Well done. Yeah, so I do. And when you might spend your time being distracted for half an hour, and you catch it, it's like, let me bring myself back. So, in a way, I say to people, just let go of how can I be mindful how can I be mindful all day, and just know that it's a practice, that it is a practice, and just know the more times you notice that you are distracted, that is being mindful. Yeah. I think people tend to forget that actually, when we've actually caught that the mind's wandered, or we've started doing something different, and we bring ourselves back, it is a mindfulness moment. And of course, there can be these things, we can say to people, well, take a mindfulness breath when you wake up, and take a mindfulness breath when you leave the house and you sit in the car, and then when you get to your office or wherever you go. And we can say to people, do that. And how often will people remember to do that? So really, it's to find your mindfulness touchstones. And it may be when you wake up in the morning and you have your cup of whatever, if it's a cup of coffee, cup of tea. For me, it's a hot water. That can be a moment of mindfulness. When you're cleaning your teeth, can be a moment of mindfulness. So really, for people to find their own unique touchstones for mindfulness and make that your practice.
That's great. So I want to go back to storytelling on another level, because it's such an essential part of our humanity when well, for one thing, when we feel like we're telling our own story and we're not just absorbing the story someone has told about us. So it can be so healing to tell our story and also rewrite those stories told about us that we've internalized. And you were trained as a journalist and worked as an international correspondent in the 90s. And I'm wondering if you can tell us how you approach storytelling in your work helping others and for yourself personally from the perspective of being Black, queer, and non binary.
Yeah, thank you for that question. In fact, I stopped being a journalist because I realized I couldn't tell the truth.
Hmm.
Yeah. And that really, I can remember actually, it was covering land rights and Aboriginal deaths in custody out in Australia. And I remember that question, or, was it a koan? It's like, am I a political activist or am I a journalist? And I just knew, I think actually, in a way, one of the things that actually got me into storytelling and being a journalist was I actually did that gap year in England, which is very normal for the privileged, to go and do a gap year. So when I was 19, I went out to Israel and worked on a kibbutz
Mm.
3 kilometers from Gaza, and spent a lot of time as a person of color. uh, I had a very different experience. In fact, I traveled with my best friend who was a person of color, and we spent quite a lot of time in Palestine, and people wanted us to tell their stories, how
Hmm.
important it was to tell their stories. And I think that's what really inspired me actually to become a journalist. Although at university I did help edit a magazine called Jezebel. So I think storytelling, as we know, is in all cultures. As we know, in the rooms of 12 steps, storytelling is such an important part of the recovery. As we know, in compassionate inquiry, you know, who did we speak to? It's so important to be able to tell your story. In my own life, I actually wrote a novel which actually did win several awards. My proud moment, it even beat Joan Didion's Magical Thinking. It was
Whoa.
up there. Yeah, I know. It's like, whoa. So, which was called Borrowed Body, and it was so interesting. I called it. It was fictional memoir, and what was so healing about that was that I could actually uh, write in something, write in my understanding of what happened and how I could save myself in a particular way. And so it was just so healing to be able to tell my story in that way and to fictionalize all the characters and myself. And it really allowed me to make sense of what had happened to me, because I think sometimes we find it so confusing and we need to reframe the story. And then again, definitely for me, in my work in anti-bullying, in conflict transformation, it really has all been about of how do we get off that cycle of story? How do we get off that cycle of addiction, or that vicious cycle of conflict, or that vicious cycle of the story? And really breaking down what actually happens in the story. So as we know, the sixth sense doors, that we have contact. So there is contact. So the trigger, what's the trigger? And then, based on contact, there is the feeling, the Vedana, which is pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. The body, where do we experience it in the body? And then we know from the Vedana, thoughts will arise, and then again, it's like those thoughts can create emotions, and emotions can create thinking, and that's where we really get hooked into the story. And then often when we're caught in this thinking, we begin to act out of that story. And there obviously there's a gain that we get from acting out that story, and there is a cost, and often that cost keeps us on that vicious cycle. And so really part of that work is how we can begin to step out of the story, how we can begin to allow ourselves to be in touch with the unpleasant or pleasant or neutral Vedana, neutral hedonic tone arising in the body. And so I just, for me, just even talking about it, it's like we live in a fiction and we can step out of the fiction. And that's one of the ways we can step out of the fiction. And it's not original. If we think, Sharon, of the Honeyball Sutta, it's all in the Honeyball Sutta, how we get caught into this cycle. And of course, one of the suttas that I do refer to in the book is the Vitakatthasana Sutta, where the Buddha gives us several ways of working with thoughts so that we can begin to step out of the story.
And another expression for you has been as a playwright, which is very intriguing to me. So, is it storytelling that drew you to that form?
Oh yeah, my days of working in the performance world, I had so much joy. In fact, I there's a pantomime called the Rose Red and Snow White. So I rewrote the pantomime, calling it The Adventures of Snow Black and Rose Red. So the two characters was for an African descent child and for a South Asian or East Asian child. And what I do is juxtapose a Nancy from the African culture who needs to drink the blood of two young maidens to have longevity. And Carly from the South Asian culture comes to rescue the poor maidens who get lost in the woods. So it was just really that joy, and just really making pantomimes very big in the UK, and just really making it culturally specific, so that actually um, not just my culture or Asian cultures, but just to have a different landscape of story. And then one of my performances was I Brown Girl in the Ring. Well, I claimed to be the Queen of England, which was such fun, really mixing fact with fiction, because the great great grandmother of Queen Victoria was half African, half German, and really playing with that, and looking at the whole racism, and looking at all the microaggressions and the macro aggressions that can happen. So yeah, and then um, writing a cult play, one of my cult plays. It's a few of the plays are in books. This one called Sin Dykes, which was written for 3 white women free black women, and really looking at sexual politics, the whole sexual politics of being in biracial relationships, the whole sexual politics when you bring in sadomasochism and what that looks like. So I had, in a way, I can remember somebody calling me, oh, what was it? Kind of a, uh, and I actually I can't remember the name now, but it was a great name. But actually, for me, in those days, I was just really telling the stories of what was happening in front of me, really documenting part of parts of history which have been lost.
And poetry is another written form that you work with. In 2020, you released I Am Still Your Negro, an homage to James Baldwin, which is a beautiful expression of your social justice work. And I wonder if you can respond to why are words and stories so essential for social justice?
Well, I would say I was saying to somebody a few months ago that many people um, in the BIPOC community, especially in the African descent, African American, Black, British, etc., we all started off performing poetry. It was one of the ways that we could have our voice. I can remember we were called protest poets. Yeah.
Mm.
And it was a way that we could have a voice. I can remember being so inspired by the shebeens. The shebeens are like illegal clubs that black people would have in the UK. They came from South Africa, called shebeens. And the toasting, when you would go to these shebeens, they would start like kind of 1 o'clock in the morning and go to 1 o'clock the next day. And actually the people who would be toasting over a record would be doing lyrics over a record, would be telling you what was happening in the community, telling you about the policing, telling you about the brutality of what was happening to our people. And it was just so inspiring. And I just think, in a way, that definitely had an influence on me writing poetry and writing in that form. And I always remember a friend of mine in England, there was an exhibition by black women, and I was a journalist, and my friend said, "You're a writer, you write poetry." And it's like, "Oh, do I?" And that's what got me writing. And then just so many of us in those communities were performing and expressing ourselves. And I think it was a way. We didn't have access to being published in those days. It was, I'd speak for the Black British
Mhm.
experience, that it was very difficult for us to get published. The only people who were really publishing Black poets would be, there were feminist Sheba, feminist publications, and then a couple of Black publications, but it was very difficult to have our work out there. So we published on the stage. That's what we did. We performed to get our message out there. So in a way, I always think that poetry and spoken word for black people came out of a social justice movement.
So powerful, to hear your perspective and your experience in all things. So, really, thank you so much. I hope we have the opportunity to speak again soon. Uh, you'll have another book come out, or I'll have a well, I don't think I'll have a book come out, but um, there'll be some opportunity, I'm sure, and because it's been really wonderful. And before we finish, I was wondering if you could lead us in a practice of some kind.
Sure, I just hopefully when I'm at Barrow, Massachusetts next year, maybe you'll be there and I
Yeah,
get to see you in person.
that'd
Yeah,
be great.
yeah. So yeah, a practice. I'll do a practice from the new book. Um, I'll do a practice of love. Okay. So yeah, just a short reflection. So just taking a moment, those of you who have been listening, just taking a moment to let all that discursive conversation just drop to the floor. Just really feel your body being supported by your seat, wherever your seat is. We're going to do a practice of love. So L stands for love or liking a part of yourself. And regardless of your skin color, race, religion, gender, or abilities, just find something to love about your body. Could be your feet or your hands or the way you stand, or the shape of your elbows or your smile. Really see if you can allow the word love to reverberate in your body. So just really inviting you to say the word love and really feel the sensations in your body when you say the word love. And I just want to acknowledge that for some people, just saying that word love aloud may be an unpleasant experience, and that really is okay. For some of you, it may be a pleasant experience or a neutral experience, and that really is okay. This is your experience. It doesn't mean to say it's wrong. It just means that when you connect with love, it makes you feel in a particular way. Really see if you can hear yourself say perhaps one of these phrases: I love my skin color, or I love my race. I love who I am. I think it's so important in today's world to really touch into loving our race or loving our skin color. Yeah. Or loving who we are or our body. And breathe. Yeah, breathing into your whole body. Really see if you can relax. And if there is a criticizing voice going on, okay, acknowledge it. And at the same time, just see if you can ask it to relax. Yeah. So you can feel some love today. Ask it to step aside so you can relax. O. O stands for owning. Own your uniqueness. O. Open up to your authentic self. Perhaps just ask yourself, what is it like? What is it like to be in relationship to your race, to your gender, to your sexuality, to your disability? What's that like for you? And really see if you can own your uniqueness. Not even identical twins are exactly the same. They too are unique. Really own your uniqueness. And be aware of your experience. As you reflect on this question, you might become aware of tension in the body. So just be aware of the tension and just ask the tension to relax. Inviting you to place a hand on the part of your body that you feel comfortable with. It might be on your lap, could be on the belly, on your heart. You choose. And I really want you to touch into the warmth of your own hand, because V stands for validating. Validate your existence. And just know that your own hand, the warmth of your hand, is validating your existence. Do not let anybody ever tell you again that you are less than anybody else. Stop believing that something is wrong with you, that you don't have the right to be here. The statement is never something is wrong with you or something is wrong with me. The statement is, what happened to me? So just validate your existence. You have every right to be here right now in this moment and feel the fullness of your presence. Touching into the warmth of your hand and validating your existence. And again, this may be pleasant, it may be unpleasant, you may experience it being neutral. Just turn towards your experience with breath. E. E stands for eliminating all the slurs that have been projected onto you, eliminating that narrative that we carry around in our mental states, eliminating some of that stinking thinking. And take a moment to touch into the sadness caused by some of the harmful things that have been said to us. Allow yourself to feel the tears, the wet tears or the dry tears. Just allow yourself to feel in to the sadness. So with whatever narratives you're in touch with, inviting you to put them into a imaginary paper bag or a wooden box and just visualize yourself burning it on a fire, and just allow all these harmful narratives that you've been carrying around for so long, just allow them to just burn. Yeah. And really see if you can begin to let go of one or two of these statements that have just dogged you for your whole life, that have just followed you around, so that we can begin to make that letter E evolve into just embracing this precious moment, embracing this moment where you can give yourself some love. So again, saying the word love and really feel the vibration in your body, and notice if it feels different this time as you say the word love, 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 love. Loving every bit of yourself or parts of yourself. For some people, it's a journey. We start where we're at. Maybe just one thing that you can love and like about yourself, and that really is okay. Own your uniqueness. Yeah, we're all unique. Validate your presence. Yeah. Don't need to wait for others to validate us. Validate your presence. And extinguish or eliminate all that prejudicial baggage that we've been carrying around. And let it go. Let it go. So you can embrace this precious moment. Love. 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 Love.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. And just to say that all the practices are recorded. So if you get the book, you'll be able to download and
Oh,
have all the
nice.
practices recorded.
Perfect.
Always a joy to be in conversation with you, Sharon. Thank you so much.
And for me as well.
Hey folks, thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Valerie's work or get a copy of their new book, First Aid Kit for the Mind, you can visit their website, ValerieMason-John.com. That is Valerie, Valerie, Mason, Mason, John, John.com. And for all things Sharon, including some brand new audiobooks of Lovingkindness and Finding Your Way, as well as a free guided meditation, you can head over to SharonSalzberg.com. This has been the Metta Hour podcast, brought to you by the Be Here Now Network. May you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, and may you live with ease.